I'll just let people filter into the room, and then we'll start. Okay. Well, we've got 47 people, which seems really good. Hi everyone. My name is Joe, and I'm going to be the chair of this session. I'm one of the organisers of the event, and also a PhD student at Cambridge. So our panel today is on prefiguring populism, and we've got 3 really exciting papers coming up, and I'll introduce each of our 3 panelists in a moment. But just a few bits of housekeeping, as usual. Keep your camera and microphone off unless you're speaking. Captioning is enabled for the event, so if you want to, as mentioned in the previous session, if you want to use that, that's there. But you can also turn it off if you don't need it. Okay, cool. And finally, the event is also being recorded, so just to make you aware of that as well. But it won't be necessarily publicly made available, but it's for the archive. So today we're going to hear from David Klemperer, Tim Karianides, and Iker Toy. And I'll introduce each of them at the beginning of the session. So David is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Queen Mary University. His PhD project is titled The Ideological Crisis of French Socialism, 1930 to 1946, and it explores how thinkers within the French Socialist Party responded to the challenges posed by fascism, communism, war, economic crisis, and the realities of holding power. Tim is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on the impact of sociological, economic, and anthropological studies of post-colonial African societies on the thinking of the New Left, primarily in Britain and France, during the 1960s and 1970s. And Iker is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Edinburgh. His thesis focuses on the political commitment of Eric Hobsbawm and his passion for politics. His current research lies broadly in the history of the European left and political theory, and he's previously researched political violence in Spain during the 20th century. So in terms of the structure of the panel, David is going to present his paper live. So that will be the first 20 minutes or so. And after David, we'll have kind of brief recaps of Tim's and Iker's papers. So they've both been circulated prior to the session, but they will give a little guide to them, both to refresh your memory, and also if you haven't had a chance to read them, to give you an idea about what the kind of key arguments are of their papers. And then we'll open up the floor to discussion. And we want it to be a kind of free-flowing discussion. So please, do just jump in and speak up if you want to. But you're also welcome to use the raise hand function on Zoom, or put a note in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and make sure to come to you if you've got a question or a contribution to make. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David, and he can present his paper.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. And thank you to all of the organisers for putting together this conference. I really enjoyed the last panel I heard. I'm really excited for this discussion, and I'm looking forward to so much more good stuff, both today and tomorrow. So to briefly introduce my paper, it's entitled Je suis épouvanté, Léon Blum as Marxist critic of left populism. It comes out of my broader historical research on 1930s French socialism. But what I want to do today is suggest a presentist comparison that I think can potentially spark some interesting discussion. So to begin, in July 1933, France's Socialist Party, the SFIO, was facing a schism. At the party's annual Congress, 3 dissident deputies, Marcel Déat, Barthélemy Montagnon, and Adrien Marquet, used their speeches to launch a trenchant attack on the party's strategy and doctrine. They outlined an alternative agenda, which came to be called neo-socialism, calling for a strong state and invoking themes of order, authority, and nation. The result was a dramatic moment. In the middle of Marquet's speech, the SFIO's longtime leader, Léon Blum, burst out, "Je suis épouvanté," I am aghast. The next day, he accused the neo-socialists of outlining the manifesto of a national socialist party and of plagiarizing fascist ideology. Over the following weeks, with a split in the party now inevitable, he used his editorials in the Socialist Daily to double down on this accusation of fascism and to advance a detailed critique of the neo-socialist heresy. Blum's denunciation appears particularly striking in light of subsequent events. Although the neo-socialists met with little success in the 1930s, a number of them acquired political significance after the conquest of France in 1940, as collaborators to varying extents with Nazism. Marcel Déat, in particular, fully embraced fascism and became one of its leading French propagandists. He died in exile in 1955, having been sentenced to death at Absentia. Blum, by contrast, led his party into the anti-fascist Popular Front, and in 1936 became France's first socialist prime minister. Since his death in 1950, he has been seen as one of the defining figures of the French left and as a principled defender of humanist democratic socialism. Historical analysis of Blum's clash with the neo-socialists has therefore been heavily colored by hindsight. Jean-François Biard, for instance, celebrates how Blum perceived the danger and with stunning prescience denounced the risk of contagion from fascism. For Biard, Blum's arguments against neo-socialism were formulated to protect democratic socialism from a deviation that found its inspiration in fascism. For David Frappé, the indictment was without appeal. Blum sounded the alarm against this ideological deviation which advocated a national and authoritarian socialism. He claims that history will give credit to Blum, who saved the doctrine of the SFIO. Perhaps most colorfully, Blum's biographer, Jean Lacouture, describes how Blum fought for 2 hours from the platform against these neos infected by fascism, a fight that continued with weapons in hand before the tribunals of Vichy and against the harbingers of Nazism. But the problem with these interpretations is that they all rely on teleological readings of neo-socialism as inherently proto-fascist. This is a mistake. Neo-socialism evolved over time, and we should not project the collaborationist politics later embraced by some neo-socialists onto the arguments made in 1933. Indeed, many neo-socialists did not become collaborationists, and some even played important roles in the French resistance. Moreover, the focus on Blum's supposed prescience obscures the real stakes of the neo-socialist controversy and the substance of the arguments made on both sides. What then was the neo-socialism that Blum was attacking? In their speeches, the neo-socialists displayed not so much an admiration for fascism as a deep fear of it. Speaking in the context of the Great Depression, and just months after Hitler's seizure of power, Déat, Marquet, and Montaigne asked why, amidst what appeared to be a crisis of capitalism, it was fascism and not socialism that was on the rise. For these three and their supporters, fascism had successfully capitalized on anti-capitalist sentiment amongst the middle classes, and on the widespread desire for a strong state that could act against the economic turmoil. To block the way to fascism, it was imperative that socialists should win power first. To do this, socialists needed to abandon traditional rhetoric and doctrine and appeal to the middle classes with promises of concrete action. Controversially, the neo-socialists spoke of action within the national framework to reflect the national reality, and they proposed order and authority as watchwords with which to rally the masses. Once in power, the neo-socialists argued that socialists should fashion a strong state and use it to transform the economy. As proof of the possibility of doing so, the neo-socialists pointed to the so-called intermediary regimes of Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and New Deal USA, which they argued all constituted breaks with capitalism in different ways. They declared that in France, socialists should be seeking to construct an intermediary regime of their own. What I want to suggest is that in many ways, what the neo-socialists were advocating here was a left populist strategy, of the kind today practiced by Podemos and La France Insoumise and other such parties and movements. Like left populism, the neo-socialist strategy was an electoralist one designed to compete directly with the far right for votes and to capitalize on widespread dissatisfaction with the status quo by reaching out beyond the traditional socialist electorate. It also involved jettisoning traditional left-wing slogans in favor of rhetoric previously associated with the nationalist right. This comparison becomes stronger when we look at the theoretical arguments underpinning neo-socialist strategy. In his 1930 book, Perspectives socialistes, Socialist Perspectives, Deyer had outlined a sociological critique of Marxism, arguing that capitalist civilization was defined as much by its dominant values as by economic relations. Deyer contended that anti-capitalism could be grounded in politics as well as economics. It therefore extended beyond the proletariat to encompass the middle class and the peasantry. Deyer believed that a political struggle for power could unite the vociferous anti-capitalist forces into a majoritarian socialist alliance, which could then use state power to gradually socialize the economy from above. There are clear parallels here with the ideas of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who have been the leading academic theorists of left populism. In their work, Laclau and Mouffe reject Marxist economic reductionism and urge the left to move beyond class politics. They offer strategies centered on electoral contestation and advocate the rhetorical construction of broad, socially heterogeneous coalitions designed to attain state power. Indeed, in their 1985 book, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, Laclau and Mouffe acknowledged the neo-socialists as having prefigured many of their own post-Marxist conceptions. Referring to the broader phenomenon of planism that the neo-socialists were part of, they herald, and this is a quote, an attempt to recast the objectives of the socialist movement in a radically new anti-economist version. They say that all the elements we saw emerging in the crisis of the economist and reductionist version of Marxism are present. The critique of rationalist conception of subjectivity based on economic interest, the critique of class reductionism, the necessity of a mass bloc broader than the working class, the need to put forward socialism as a national alternative, as an organic reconstitution of the nation on a new basis, the requirement of a myth in the Sorelian sense, which would cement the diverse components of a collective socialist will, end quote. The neo-socialists then were the post-Marxist left populists of their day. Blum's arguments against the neo-socialists, by contrast, rested on a very different theoretical foundation. Since even before he had become party leader, Blum had presented himself as the defender of French socialism's traditional Marxist doctrine. Claiming to recognize only one socialism, revolutionary socialism, he consistently proclaimed the SFIO's goal to be social revolution, which he defined as a total transformation of the system of property from private to collective ownership. Blum insisted this could not be the product of accumulated reforms. It would be an absolute categorical change, and it would require the conquest of power by the Socialist Party. But Blum was also clear that this conquest of power was a necessary but insufficient condition for revolution. He warned against confusing it for the revolution and against attempting it before economic conditions for revolution were ripe. It was on this point that from 1920, Blum distinguished French socialism from Leninist communism, which he accused of making the conquest of power an end in itself. For Blum, the task of the Socialist Party was not the seizure of state power as fast as possible, but rather to prepare for the revolution by pushing reforms within capitalism and by building an organized, class-conscious proletariat. Socialists were to pursue the daily effort of propaganda and the extension within capitalist society of workers of organizations of all kinds, upon which collectivist society will one day be based. Blum was dismissive of the idea that socialists could achieve much in this regard by holding ministerial office. Indeed, he saw this as potentially undermining the organization of the proletariat by arousing false hopes. He therefore rejected the idea of socialist ministers serving in centre-left coalitions, something he termed participation in power. However, from 1925, he accepted that should socialists find themselves as the largest party in parliament, they would have to form a government, and they would have to undertake what he termed the exercise of power. Crucially, Blum distinguished this exercise of power from the future revolutionary conquest of power. Unlike the conquest of power, the exercise would have to occur strictly within the capitalist, legal, and economic framework, and it could not be used to begin the construction of socialism. It could only be used for propaganda and to accelerate the speed of reform within capitalism. It was this framework of distinguishing between participation, exercise, and conquest that defined Blum's approach to political power, and that informed his strategy as leader. So when in 1933, Deya, Marquet, and Montagnon argued for the overriding urgency of acquiring power and for the need for socialists to use power to break with capitalism, Blum correctly saw a rejection of his framework. It was for this, above all, that he attacked the neo-socialists. What then were Blum's arguments? And I'm going to apologize in advance because this section is extremely quote heavy. Blum argued that in their drive for power, the neo-socialists were presenting it as a means to achieving concrete ends, and thus conferring in advance on the exercise of power the specific characteristics of the conquest. Blum reiterated the exercise of power could not bring transformation, but was only useful in accelerating the pace of the evolution of capitalism. And he further said that the potential for useful reform within the framework of capitalist society is limited. So to present the exercise of power as a means of action could therefore only engender disappointment, and actually attempting the conquest of power was no solution, because this could only be the object of proletarian struggle to the extent that the revolution could be executed by means of it. But the revolution depended on economic conditions, and Blum did not believe that these were ripe. For Blum then, the error of the neo-socialists was thus the illusion of the virtue of political power. For Blum, however, the neo-socialist approach to power was not simply mistaken. It also had dangerous implications for how socialists would pursue politics. Blum argued that with the neo-socialist approach, the taking of power becomes the essential object and driving element of socialist propaganda. This propaganda would then necessarily take the form of a popular agitation waged around a few simple slogans, presented to the masses as formulas of salvation. It was this that Blum condemned most forcefully at the party congress. He argued that socialists had never engaged in such crude sloganeering, that it reflected a patronizing attitude towards the workers, and that it risked disorganizing them by sparking false hopes. Moreover, these simple slogans, these base appeals, trying to play on the immediate instincts within the popular masses, these are precisely the means which fascism has always sought to use. It was in this way that Blum claimed the neo-socialists were, in their haste to win power before fascism, borrowing its own weapons and, what is worse, its own ideology. Importantly, it was not just how the neo-socialists sought to build an electoral coalition that Blum condemned. It was also the very nature of that coalition itself. Accusing the neo-socialists of seeking to turn the SFIO into a party of déclassés, he denounced the idea of rallying around us these disorganized masses of heterogeneous values. Rather, he said it was the fundamentals of socialism that the opposition of classes meant that the Socialist Party had to be an autonomous class party of the proletariat. For Blum, to move beyond working class politics risked warping the party's program from a statement of principles into something designed to appeal to what he called the average consent of the nation. Specifically, the neo-socialists' proposed coalition with the middle class would necessarily undermine the Socialist Party's revolutionary goals, because what the neo-socialists saw as middle-class anti-capitalism was merely opposition to capitalist power, excess, or oppression. It therefore could not serve as the basis for the action of any socialist party, since Blum maintained that socialism was not opposed to capitalist power, excess, or oppression, but to capitalism itself. Overall then, in the 1933 Socialist Split, we can see a clear contrast of approaches. The neo-socialists' urgent electoralism clashing with Blum's patient strategy of class-based revolutionary preparation. What we see then is that Blum was not defending democratic socialism from fascism, so much as a specific form of Marxist political practice from a strategic and doctrinal innovation that has much in common with contemporary left populism. Why might it be useful to read this debate in terms of left populism? I want to finish with 3 brief points that I hope can serve as the basis for discussion. Firstly, it allows us to decenter fascism and move past teleological readings in our analysis of neo-socialism. Analyzing neo-socialism in light of similar contemporary approaches allows us to see it for what it really was. Not a proto-fascist ideology, but a voluntarist and anti-economistic effort to reorient democratic socialist politics in the face of a far-right threat. Secondly, it provides a much clearer picture of the intellectual role that Blum was playing within French socialism at the time. Rather than the guarantor of French socialism's democratic integrity, he was the defender of a very particular orthodoxy. He was also much more of a Marxist thinker than has generally been acknowledged, and I would argue that we can see echoes of his arguments in contemporary Marxist critiques of left populism, and I'd be very happy to expand on that in the discussion. Thirdly, it helps us put debates over left populism in a longer historical perspective. As much as left populist theories and strategies can be contextualized as a response to relatively recent developments, what we see in the debate over neo-socialism is that many of the issues at stake have been around much longer. It is perhaps not merely the crises of our era that parallel those of the 1930s, but the left-wing responses to them as well. I'll leave it there, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion and to hearing Tim and Iker's papers. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. That was really interesting, and an area which, a debate which a debate which I didn't know a huge amount about, and I hopefully we'll have a really good discussion on that. Could I just ask everyone to mute and turn off their camera if they're not speaking? That would be really great. That'd be helpful for the discussion. Okay, so we'll now move on to Tim. And Tim, like I said, Tim's paper has been pre-circulated. And I'm just going to ask him if he could summarize in a few minutes the kind of key points of his paper. Is Tim still here?
Yes, I'm here.
You're here. Sorry, you just put off my screen, and I thought, oh my God, he's gone. But no, he's here. Okay. Yeah. So if you could just, I think you said you prepared kind of 5-10 minutes on your paper. So
yeah, sure thing. And thanks, Joe, and to all other organizers for organizing such a great conference in the midst of all of this chaos, and to all of the participants and to everybody who read my paper. Thanks a lot. I know it's very long, so I'm just going to summarize it in 2.5 pages, basically. And I'm going to read from a script so I don't go all over the place. All right, so my paper argues that the rise of the study of development and underdevelopment of the third world in Britain at the end of the 1960s is an important context for understanding the reception of French ideas by the British New Left in this period. I argue that historians' accounts of the period have until now been inflected by polemics that took place in the 1970s that pitted the Marxist humanism of E.P. Thompson and English Marxist historiography against the structuralism of Perry Anderson and the post-1962 editorial board of the New Left Review. Most accounts of the British New Left take 1956, the year in which the Soviets invaded Hungary and in which the Suez Crisis took place, as a decisive turning point for the formation of the New Left as an intellectual and political force in Britain. The British New Left thus develops in the wake of de-Stalinisation and the collapse of the British Empire. The reception of French ideas in England, however, is not usually considered in terms of this immediate post-colonial and post-imperial context of British society and the British social sciences, and this is essentially what my paper aims to address. I show how a National Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex is formed in 1967 in the wake of the collapse of the ambitious development programs that had begun in third world countries in the 1950s and the 1960s. In the early 1960s, the United Nations enthusiastically championed a development decade, in which policies which encourage high growth rates in countries of the third world were considered sufficient to significantly reduce inequalities between countries of the global north and countries of the global south within just 1 decade. Unsurprisingly, by the end of the 1960s, it was acknowledged by international development agencies themselves, like the World Bank, in their famous Pearson's report, that high growth rates in most parts of the third world had not been accompanied by significant decreases in levels of poverty and inequality. The early research of the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex was a response to this context. This was the period of dependency theory, which found its most influential articulation in the work of Andre Gunther Frank. The basic idea of dependency theory was that capitalism is a worldwide system of accumulation which produces development in some parts of the world and underdevelopment in others, was combined in this period with the Institute's attempt to decenter economic growth from the development agendas of the third world and shift focus instead to the basic needs of poorest communities in these societies. This revisionist moment in the study of development became the subject of interest and debate amongst the younger Marxist social scientists influenced or implicated in the third worldism of the post-1968 moment. These Marxists became interested in questions of the effects of capitalist transformation on the economies of the periphery of the capitalist world system. There were prominent debates around the nature of pre-capitalist modes of production and agrarian change under capitalism in this context. So alongside the New Left Review, journals like the Journal of Development Studies, the Journal of Peasant Studies, the Journal of Contemporary Asia, the Review of African Political Economy, Economy and Society, and many others became important disseminators of cutting-edge neo-Marxist ideas in the 1970s. It is in these more specialist journals that a school of French Marxist anthropologists of Africa, which emerged out of the path-breaking work of Georges Blandier and Claude Meillassoux in the early 1960s, first received an audience in Britain. Their theoretical proximity to Althusserian Marxism and the fact that their more sociologically oriented approaches to African societies distanced them from the more speculative ambitions of Levi-Straussian structuralist anthropology, destined them for a broader reception in the burgeoning neo-Marxist atmosphere of the British social sciences at the time. The most influential concept of the French anthropologists in the British Academy was the notion of articulation of modes of production. This theory referred to the idea that pre-capitalist modes of production may be reinforced and repurposed in the course of the development of capitalism in third world societies, rather than simply being superseded by capitalism, as economistic Marxism or modernization theory had presumed. Meillassoux, for instance, on the basis of his fieldwork conducted in West Africa, suggested that the maintenance of pre-capitalist self-sustaining communities in many post-colonial African societies played a crucial role in the cheap reproduction of the labor force in these economies. Through low wages and precarious employment, workers are periodically expelled by the capitalist sector and sent back to rural areas where subsistence economies can provide collective security to them. While these ideas were widely discussed and debated in more specialist development and area studies circles, they would reach a wider New Left audience thanks to, I argue, the South African sociologist Harold Volpe, who had been teaching in London since his daring escape from apartheid South Africa in 1963. In his 1972 paper, Capitalism and Cheap Labour Power in South Africa, Volpe draws on the French anthropologist to explain the relationship between the development of capitalism in South Africa and the nature of the apartheid state. The importance of Volpe's analysis lay not so much in the details of his account of apartheid, rather it was the way in which he deployed the theories of the French anthropologists on the relationship between pre-capitalist and capitalist modes of production to investigate a determinate form of state and its corresponding ideology. Louis Althusser's idea of the relative autonomy of the political superstructure vis-a-vis the economic base is widely acknowledged to have been influential on the variety of post-Marxist theories that emerged in the 1980s in the work of thinkers like Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, and Stuart Hall. It is not frequently recognized, however, that while this relative autonomy of the political is elaborated in terms of a discourse theoretical framework or the thought of Antonio Gramsci in the 1980s, it was first theorized with the help of the notion of articulation of modes of production, a concept forged in the course of studies of the political economy of post-colonial African states. In Ernesto Laclau's earliest theories of studies of populism, he deploys the concept of articulation to think the relationship between social and economic classes and generic categories like the people. In 1980, in a paper entitled Race, Articulation, and Society Structured in Dominance, Stuart Hall similarly uses the concept to theorize the complex overdetermined relationship between race and class. I close the paper by arguing that this grounding of post-Marxism in the insights of the political economy of the third world fades out of view in the 1980s. By the end of the 1970s, development studies ceases to be a terrain for shared theoretical elaboration in the left-wing social sciences in Britain, with the ascendancy of neoliberalism and the increasingly specialized and idiographic nature of area studies. The kind of sociological and historical grounding that had characterized neo-Marxist political thought in the 1970s gave way to philosophical reflections on the nature of the political as a way of challenging the hegemony of liberal philosophies of Habermas and Rawls in the 1980s. These new political ontologies no longer had any space to incorporate the insights of studies of the political economy of Africa and the third world. So that's just a short summary of the arguments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. I'll just ask like one follow-up question,
sure.
Just to let you expand a little bit on some of the material in the paper. I was kind of really interested in what you were saying around, you were almost doing like a kind of genealogy of this notion of articulation in a way.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's really like, it seems like like you would indicate there, we tend to associate with that kind of discursive mode
Yes,
of Marxism, and they're quite almost like an independent political logic, right? Much as David was describing in terms of this kind of left populist kind of strategy. But you seem to want to ground it more in like the kind of economics, right, and the kind of political economy of these anthropologists. So do you think you'll make it almost like you're saying that it has more Marxism in it than sort of post-Marxism in a way?
Yeah, in a way, like I think I have a quote by Stuart Hall late in the paper where he says, what's interesting about Volpe's analysis of apartheid South Africa is that it's taking seriously the autonomy of apartheid ideology and this racist state that's formed. It's not, but not by completely jettisoning the political, I mean the economic, but by elaborating it in its fully complex form. So I think while the later elaborations of post-Marxism, especially in the Klein Muff, where there's this railing against class essentialism and the focus on different forms of agency. The earlier moment of this debate was actually also trying to elaborate a more nuanced and complex idea of the economic determinism. So Althusser gives us a very vague idea of there's determination by the economy in the last instance. So a lot of new left thinkers are influenced by that idea, but it's really these anthropologists who are thinking about the complex linking up of non-capitalist economies with an emergent capitalism that gives the new left a more sophisticated idea of economic determinism, outside of the more stagist or economistic understandings of more orthodox Marxism. So I think that's why people are interested in these debates about the nature of the political economy of the third world.
Yeah, no, really good, wonderful. I was struck in your paper with that quote from Stuart Hall where he says it's economic determination in the first instance.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a nice one, because it's almost like in both the first and the last instance in a way. That's what they're trying to meld the two together in some sense. Wonderful. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Tim. We'll move on to Iker, and we'll do the same sort of structure. So Iker, if you could give us a bit sort of short overview of your paper, and then I've got a few follow-up questions as well.
Okay, I'm going to try to be brief. So thank you very much I'm very excited to participate in this conference. So basically what I tried to do in this article was to shed light on the Marxism of Erich Hobsbawm since 1956. I sought not only to explain what was and what was not Marxist for Erich Hobsbawm, but I also aimed to integrate his political affiliation to Marxism into a general history of Western Marxism since 1956. In this sense, I follow Perry Anderson's definition of a Western Marxist tradition that was born around the 1920s and ended around 1968. There are historical continuities between Western European Marxists from 1920 to 1968, all of them influenced by the impact of World War I and the Russian Revolution in the understanding of their focus. And moreover, this tradition was characterized from a change of both from Central Europe to Western Europe, and also from political activists to university lecturers. I argue that the Hobsbawm Marxists underwent a crisis, an important change from the long period of 1956 to 1977. First of all, the crisis of 1956 in the Communist War, and also the influence of Italy, and concretely the readings of Gramsci, altered how Hobsbawm understood his Marxism. From his reflections on primitive rebels and subalterns, he moved from a more orthodox Marxist whose focus was the working class and the Communist Party, to a more flexible and dynamic Marxist whose main elements can be summarized as, first of all, a method to study capitalism, secondly, a method to study the relation of social force in any given society, where class is just one element and contrary to classic Marxism, not the main one. And finally, an emphasis on the materialist conception of history, which focuses on human societies and the development through history. Moreover, from the influence of Italy, his readings on Marxism and the impact of political events from 1968 with the students' revolt in Paris, the impact of the society with human face in Czechoslovakia, and also from the changing intellectual landscape in France with the anti-totalitarian movement and the rise of new left thinkers such as Derrida or Foucault or Guattari. He started to reflect on what was the role of the working class in the shaping of the revolutionary future. And his ideas were first tested on a series of conferences on labor history in Paris between 1975 and 1977, alongside other prominent historians such as Michel Perrot, Madeleine Rebrieux, E.P. Thompson, Chastili, Jacodot, etc. The conclusions he reached by sharing his idea with these historians in Paris led to his most important contribution to the political debate in the UK. In particular, his famous lecture, The Forward March of Labour Halt. It sparked a great controversy in the British left during the 80s, as Hobsbawm not only denies the straightforward line of development toward, and thus the inability of working class victory, but by suggesting it had to stop, called for a rethinking of the strategy and method. This is the beginning of the so-called modernisation debate in the Labour Party, that it was the most and more relevant intellectual debate in the 80s in the British left. Furthermore, what I try to do in this paper is to emphasize the complexity and varieties of Marxist thought through the example of Hobsbawm. Traditionally, Hobsbawm has been inscribed in the British Marxist historian tradition of historiographical contributions to social theory through class analysis and history below. However, and this is one of the points that I argue, his numerous contacts with European Marxists and as well as from Latin America put him more in the European tradition rather than the insularity of the British island. One point that I try to do is to emphasize the circulation of influence, ups and downs, and the complexity of Marxist theory. Briefly to do so, I tried in the paper to look at three elements. First of all, the networking of people that Hobsbawm met in Italy, and concretely the people that he met from the Communist Party, as for example, Deglio Cantimoro, Piero Sraffa, or Giulio Einaudi, members of the Communist Party of Italy, where he serves and reflects on Gramsci's theory, on Gramsci's ideas, and on the strategy of the Communist Party. Secondly, I look at his contact with historians in France. First of all, in the 50s, when he participated in an international conference with historians such as Pierre Vilar and Fernand Braudel, who put him in contact with the annals, but also in the aforementioned conference in 1975 and 1977, where he could share his ideas about the future of the working class that led to his famous article in the Forward March of Labour Halt in 1977, in the pages of Marxist today. Secondly, another thing that I try to do is how political events affected the way that Hobsbawm understood his political commitment to communists, and how it sparked reflections on the strategy. In the paper, I mentioned Czechoslovakia and Paris, which are two important political events that affect the communist war, especially in Europe. And finally, and this is something that I don't emphasize enough in the paper, is not only how important it is to reflect about the idea, but the importance of sharing this idea with people, and how by the contact constant with people all over Europe and the world, you can arrive to interesting developments in Marxist theory, as he did in 1977, suggesting that the working class victory was not inevitable. On the contrary, looked that they were failing and they had to rethink the strategy of the working class and the communist parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iker. That was a really good summary of your paper, which I really enjoyed reading. When I was reading it over yesterday, and I really shed a lot of light on a kind of this kind of political trajectory of how it Hobsbawm in effect in this period. And I kind of wanted to ask about this kind of pivotal moment, right, when he gives this lecture on the Forward March of Labour Halted, because I suppose it's tempting to read that lecture in terms of what comes afterwards, right? Like the defeats of the 1980s, the defeat of the miners' strike, the rise of Thatcherism, neoliberalism. But I suppose what you want to say is that actually it's more productive to read it going back. Am I right in thinking that we need to understand it?
One of the things that Yes, one of the things that I'm trying to do probably in my research in terms of what is the debates on the 80s is not trying to read Hobsbawm retrospectively. This idea the new labor was set to happen, and the 80s is just a long debate about how the modernization of the Labour Party has to be something similar of what it was Tony Blair in the 90s. They usually use Everett Hobsbawm, whose ideas in the 80s look very similar to what it was New Labour, but he was not doing it as a member of the Labour Party, but rather he was thinking about the strategy of the communist parties and the communist parties in Europe. Now, in Hobsbawm's mind, what he thought is that in order to arrive to any sort of socialist revolution in the UK, it will never be through the Communist Party, but rather from the Labour Party, who was the party who represented the working class. Secondly, from the crisis of 1956, and if you look at many of the Hobsbawm reflections and contacts, he was already thinking about the strategy of the Communist Party. He rejected the Stalinists, and he realized that they need to be more dynamics. And from the impasse of events such as 1968, he realized that there has been societal changes, and with the emergence of the new socialist movements such as feminists, he realized that somehow the communist parties need to adapt to that changes, that they need to construct larger alliances that are not necessarily just the working class. That's how he arrived to these conclusions in 1977. Now, of course, he got into many more debates in the 80s, so based on what was happening in British politics, but the origins, I think, is in these long periods between 1956 and 1977, where communist parties, especially in Western Europe, tried to find a way to construct a majority, or at least to win the elections.
Sorry. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think that came through really, really strongly in the paper, and connects up nicely with some of the things actually that David and Tim also said. And I suppose the last thing I wanted to mention was you sort of hint at one point in the paper that in a way it almost goes back before 1956, and that for Hobsbawm, the Popular Front strategy sort of provides an orient that in the 1930s almost provides his kind of political orientation throughout his career. Do you think that was particularly pivotal in a way for how Hobsbawm understood politics throughout this whole period?
It is, but I haven't yet found a way how to connect properly all these elements, because it's definitely that the Popular Front and anti-fascism plays a pivotal role in his way to understand his politics. I have been trying to look whether by looking at the political emotions and how the importance of symbols and your own experience shapes your own political ideas. I think one thing that Hobsbawm did quite well politically and intellectually is how he connected his experience of the 30s in constructing a strategy for the British left in the 80s, when he was suggesting these constructions of alliances, which somehow sounded similar to the Popular Front in the 30s, but of course the context of the 80s is not the context of the 30s. Is definitely from his personal experience. The idea of anti-fascism and the idea of fighting the common enemy was fundamental to him. But how to make this connection with the context of the 70s and 80s is not that easy, because they are completely different. And somehow he tries to constantly see the 80s is like the 30s because we have an economic crisis, we had fascism, but they are definitely not the same. And it's one of the problems to balance all these perspectives.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. No, I think that's really interesting to kind of make those big, because obviously you've got an intellectual like Hobsbawm who kind of he covers the whole of that kind of short 20th century, as he calls it, right? And he lives through these various different moments of political contestation, and there's obviously going to be these continuities, but also discontinuities. So that was really interesting. Okay, wonderful. So I think we'll open it up for Q&A now. I see Owen has got his hand up. I'll come to him in just a moment because Rob has put a question in the chat to David. Solange also has a question. I'll come to you both and Nicholas. Okay, we've got lots of questions. That's exciting. So I'll just do Rob's question from the chat, which is to David, and then we'll come to the other people with their hands up. So Rob is asking, thanks for your paper, David. Really interesting presentation, especially the comparison with Lachlau and Moon. The latter often cite Gramsci in their critique of economism, while passing over his twin critique of ideologism in silence. Would you see Bloom's intervention as resonating with a critique of ideologism?
Could I ask Rob to clarify exactly what he means by a critique of ideologism here?
Can you hear me okay? I've moved onto my mobile phone.
I can hear you, yes.
Great. I mean, there's a famous passage, I think, in the notebooks where Gramsci kind of talks about the way in which kind of actually existing Marxisms, I guess, not his term, but have kind of moved down twin paths. And I think he's got the Second International in mind in terms of both kind of suffering from economism, which is obviously a critique of that is then taken up, as I say, by the Leclerc move. But he's also at the same time saying, and there is a kind of twin problem, which is that of ideologism, which is a kind of exaggeration of the voluntarist or the individual element in history, and kind of overlooking the fact that sort of struggles proceed by the real conquest of the historical world, I think is the phrase he uses. And as I say, it's that aspect that Leclerc move, and actually, I mean, the mediating factor is Eurocommunism here in the debates that were just being referred to in the last paper, that coming from their origins in the Eurocommunist debates, Leclerc move kind of just move over that in silence. And I'm wondering whether there's a resonance there with Bloom's attack on the neo-socialists, whether he's kind of attacking a similar, whether there are connections there with the critique that you've been reading.
Yeah, I think that definitely resonates with Bloom's critique, which is absolutely a critique of voluntarism. And the way Bloom is consistently defending what he sees as socialism's traditional doctrine throughout the 20s and 30s is a very anti-voluntarist thing. I mean, he first sort of is properly defining socialism against Leninism, and he sees the problem with Leninism in that Leninism is this voluntarist idea where you seize the state as soon as possible and you use the state to kind of bring he calls it a forced maturation of economic conditions. Whereas Bloom is saying that's all wrong. And so that's why he sees this neo-socialist electoralism that wants to seize the state as fast as possible as completely mistaken. And it's notable, he accuses the neo-socialists of Bolshevism, in fact, and fascism and Blanchism, all of which he sees as these voluntarist ideologies that want to rush ahead and seize the state and avoid what he sees as the key work of revolutionary preparation. Does that make sense as an answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Just one final kind of connection that might be interesting to examine in that is the way that Leclerc move phrased their project as what they call an anti-passive revolution. And I think this is kind of, in a way, seizing on the strategy of passive revolution of the existing hegemonic group and trying to repurpose that for their own tools. And maybe there's this kind of similarity there about the critiques of left populism are to a certain extent about to what extent that's possible, or to what extent that's sort of throwing out of the mix some of the distinctive things that subaltern groups have in their arsenal, and they lose if they go down the route of left populism.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Okay, thanks Rob and David for that exchange. I think Owen was next. Do you want to ask a question, Owen?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm just trying. Oh, yeah, I've been able to turn the video on as well. So I've got a question for Iker and maybe a very brief one for David. But following on from what Joe was saying, Iker, about how you're kind of tracing where Hobsbawm's arguments in the forward march of Labour halted, where they're kind of coming from rather than what they led to. And you were mentioning, his engagements with the Italian Communist Party that turned towards Eurocommunism, and then those Labour history debates that were going on in France. As well as the academic conferences in France, the 1976 conference of the French Communist Party, I think it's the 22nd Congress, is of course the one where they drop the commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat, quite importantly. And there were responses to that. I'm thinking particularly of Etienne Balibar's, book-length defense of the concept and the practice of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which might be an interesting response to Bloom's attacks on Bolshevism as well. But that's part of the story here, particularly the kind of Anglo-French bit of it, right? That's what's going on in the French Communist Party. To what extent is Hobsbawm kind of influenced by that, if he's thinking in the the terms of the European tradition of what has happened to the communist parties? And then also, I mean, don't we need to kind of reckon with Eurocommunism as a failed political strategy? And if Hobsbawm was kind of in the orbit of that, then it's a wrong turn at a wrong moment, isn't it? So I wonder what you might have to say about that. And then if I might also ask a kind of brief question to David, you were picking up on some of the kind of presentist resonances of these debates that were going on at that time, and thinking about the populism of Podemos, for example. And insofar as that as far as I kind of see it, is a sort of borrowing of certain Latin American strategies that orientate towards the national popular. But of course, in the Latin American context, that's going to be necessarily anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist for the left. But when European lefts start trying to orientate towards the national popular, the national is rather kind of different. And one of the echoes I was hearing in what you were talking about was this very kind of deeply opportunistic and unprincipled turn that we've seen the British Labour Party make now that Keir Starmer's taken over the reins and he wants to sort of drape himself in the flag. I don't suggest there's any kind of theoretical grounding to that, the way that you're talking about. But you know, you're talking about something that's, you know, far more sophisticated and important. But there is a danger, isn't there, that kind of turn is basically just unprincipled opportunism. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yes, so in the terms of the French Communist Party, I think I did not mention this in the paper. I should definitely do it. In the case of Horace Hobsbawm, he never had good relations with any member of the Communist Party of France in general. He has a strong disagreements, especially from 1956, because he thought that the French Communist Party was extremely orthodox and followed too much the line from Moscow. So he didn't feel comfortable sharing his ideas or engaging with communists from France. So his contacts with France was mainly as an historian. And that's why I mentioned the International Conference of 1950 when he met Pierre Vilar and Fernando Braudel, and the kind of conference of labor history. It is true, as you said, about the dropping of the dictatorship of the Proletarian on 1976. I think the Spanish Communist Party did so in 1975, and this is related with the rethinking of the strategy of Western communism in regards to Euro-communism. The reasons why I've stress more the Italian Communist Party is that Hobsbawm contacts with the Italian Communist Party were stronger. He usually wrote in Rinascita alla Unità, which are two important journals from Italy. He knew the main leaders of the PCI, not only Enrico Berlinguer, who was the leader at the time, he also knew Giorgio Napolitano. So there was a more everyday contact, more contact between members of the Communist Party with Italy in relation to France, that it was more intellectual. Eurocommunism, there are many ways to read it. And one of the things that I emphasize on my research is that Eurocommunism was one response to the war crisis in the 70s, at least from a European perspective, especially if you look at the crisis of first 1968, and there was the economic crisis in 1973. And what is important to emphasize that it was one response, a response that failed in Italy, fails in Spain, and it fails in France. In the case of the UK, Erich Hobsbawm is one of these intellectuals who tried to push these policies further into the 80s. And his idea was this kind of broad alliances of different parts of the British societies toward the Labour Party. The results were definitely not what he was expecting. Margaret Thatcher was not defeated in the 90s. The result, which New Labour, was something that he regret, and he denies that he has anything to do in the shaping of New Labour. Now, one of the things that I try to emphasize that, of course, it was not set to happen, and he was not trying to be New Labour, but in the way that he emphasized the need to modernize the language, to modernize the political strategies, to modernize the policies. And that critique was launched for someone that was considered in the UK context as a very loyal member of the Communist Party and a very left intellectual. He definitely opened the ground among others intellectuals to this reshaping of the ideological grounds of the Labour Party and what were the policies of the party at the time.
Thanks, thank you.
So to just briefly respond on the point about the nation, I think that with the sort of neo-socialist embrace of the nation, there are a couple of things going on. So firstly, it was a kind of embrace of the national state and the ability of the national state to do things. So one of their arguments in favor of this sort of action within the national framework was that they said in the 1930s, capitalism was retreating behind national borders. They looked at fascism and they said, well, we have these protectionist economies. So if capitalism is organized at the national level, socialism has to fight it at the national level. So that was one part of the argument. The other thing in the sort of more rhetorical appeal to the nation is I think that the advantage that the sort of French left saw they had is that they can appeal to the revolutionary tradition. I think there's a lot of Jacobinism that filters into the neo-socialist rhetoric. But obviously, I think there are two sort of big problems that you very rightly point to. The first is colonialism, where the French left, with a few honorable exceptions, the French left in the 1920s and 30s just had a complete blind spot there in terms of the sort of, certainly the Socialist Party. Most of these people were just not giving colonialism very much thought. And where they did give it thought, it was to repeat sort of very basic liberal platitudes about the League of Nations and preparing colonies for independence. So, you know, you can definitely see how that means that they just wouldn't have been thinking about the sort of problematic colonial implications of talking about the nation. And then the second point you mentioned is opportunism. And I think that, yeah, that is absolutely true. And if you look at what happens to the neo-socialists, a lot of them in the 1930s do just drift towards pure opportunism, attempting to form sort of alliances with more centrist parties. Once they leave the Socialist Party, they are left sort of politically adrift. They do not succeed as a sort of split. And that leads them to different places, opportunism in the 30s, and ultimately some of them into fascism. But I think there's a very sort of long and complicated story of why they end up there. But I think you're right to point to some of the difficulties with the national framing.
Thanks very much. That's very clear. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Owen, for those questions and the responses. I think Solange was next, and then I'll come to the two people with their hands up.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for these excellent papers. As one of the co-organizers, I feel like I need to apologize first of all for this like gender imbalance of this panel, and I hope that everyone was convinced that all the papers corresponded so well to each other and really talked to each other, and that was the reason why we decided in the end to opt to keep it like this. But thank you for these wonderful papers, and I had a question that sort of, I guess, resonates into also what Owen was mentioning previously, and I sort of want to draw it back to the French context to see everything that has been discussed within the light of the French kind of post-68 moment. And it's particularly more question for Tim, but I think everyone can engage with it. And one of the things that I particularly liked, David, in your paper, was this idea of this kind of teleological reading of the left, and perhaps a more radical left, as seeing how it contains this kind of seed of fascism, or this moment inevitable turn towards, you know, totalitarianism, which you get, of course, in the French 68 moment, and also with the new philosophers. And Iker, you also mentioned this. I mean, you cite the French Intellectuals Against the Left by Christopher, of course, as well, where that idea is being developed in, and you compare it, or you place Hobsbawm within this context. And so, yeah, my question was particularly for Tim, because at the end of your paper, you reflect on how kind of this notion of the third world grows kind of absent in British Marxism, and I was wondering if that is also due, or whether you know, to the fact that it's kind of instrumentalized. The third world is instrumentalized in the same way as Marxism itself in the post-68 moment, where ex-gauchiste, and here rely much on Kristen Ross kind of reading as well, ex-gauchiste, really trying to see that, or map it on to this equivalent made between totalitarianism and Marxism itself. And Jacques Julliard, for example, said that, you know, in Africa, there will be no socialism except a totalitarian socialism. You of course bring it up in relation to a more general kind of strengthening or rise of neoliberalism. But I wonder if you think that the connection to France and this influence there of kind of this moment of anti-Marxism really seems to be a stronger kind of anti-Marxism in France than maybe in Britain, as you showed that kind of persists. Do you think that connection is kind of relevant to your broader analysis, that absence?
My intuition, and I mean, people who know more about kind of the twists and turns of British Marxism may, butt in here, is that there isn't well, I don't think what's motivating the changes in, say, Leclerc and Stuart Hall's thought is really, it's more about the adaptation of socialist strategy and less about the problems of totalitarianism. From the point of view of the social sciences and development theory and all of that, I think from the perspective of Marxist development theorists, I think they're skeptical of development theories, not because they were totalitarian, but because they were populist. So I was thinking of spinning it in that way because this panel was about populism. But the Marxists basically just thought that, like African socialism in Tanzania, certain developments in Kenya weren't taking seriously the kinds of transformations in the peasantry that these development policies were creating. And so created these oversimplified ideas of populist ideas of, it's not exactly a problem with totalitarianism, just an inadequate kind of class analysis of the impact of development theories. And then why neoliberalism, is ascendant is more practical reason. So, all of these development policies, from modernization theory to the ones that supersede them about basic needs, presupposed the presence of a strong kind of social democratic state that could implement a wide-ranging economic plan. And the fact of the matter in the 1980s was that the kind of state infrastructure never developed in Africa, and it was much easier for neoliberal ideologues to go to African elites and say, well, your solution is in the market, don't worry about building a state or whatever. It was just, neoliberalism was more practical at this moment than the kind of social democratic underpinnings of development theory up to that point. And I think that's why it got this strong kind of audience on the African continent that persists to this day.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and thank you for highlighting the issue of the gender imbalance on this panel, Solange. I think you're right that we tried to ensure a balance in all of the panels, but occasionally just certain papers fitted together in such a way that wasn't possible. Wonderful. Yes, I think Nicholas has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. And perhaps see me. I'm not sure. Yes. Okay. I have a question for David. Actually, thank you for your paper. Actually, I was interested in the relationship you established between that moment of the split of the Socialist Party in Bloom's time, let's say, and the relevance for thinking about politics of the left in the present. I have a very simple question, and perhaps it goes a bit beyond your paper, but I wanted to hear your opinion out of what you said. I touch upon some things Owen said before me as well, because I see, I mean, if one follows your analysis, someone like Leclerc or Mouffe you're being very critical of them in terms of the way in which they are kind of trying to sort out the issue of the relationship, let's put it this way, between the masses and the state, or the masses and the electionary processes and the participation of the left within that frame. And that's a view that you find in. Sorry, can you hear me?
I missed the very beginning of your question, and just a sentence right there.
Okay. I'll retrace a bit. There is a sense in which Mouffe and Laclau have been heavily criticized from Marxist camps in Europe. But my feeling is that some of their ideas have been taken up by in Latin America specifically very differently, and the relationship between the very idea of populism and the state in Latin America kind of plays out really in a different way in relation to the specific issue of the modernization of the state, and how the left would be, or left parties would be, the only parties able actually to modernize the state and the economy of societies in order to trigger eventually a full revolutionary process. And I see that a bit in the discourse of someone like Garcia Linera in Bolivia, or other movements for socialism in Latin America. I could go back even to Allende, actually. But so my question is, your critique to this, let's call it populist strategy within the left, would you consider it always situated? I mean, you mentioned situated in the sense that that critique would have to be historically situated, geographically situated, economically situated, and I see your target is so some of the European parties like Podemos or Mélenchon's group in Paris, etc. Would you extrapolate that critique to other groups in other parts of the world, or that would have to be accounted for in a contextual sense as well? So that's my question. I don't know if I'm clear enough.
I think I understand your question. I think what I'd say though is I don't think my paper is necessarily meant as a critique of Laclau and Mouffe. I am setting out what Blum's critique of the neo-socialists was, and I think that has a lot of interesting parallels with contemporary arguments about left populism, but I wouldn't see my paper as particularly trying to take a side there. If anything, by making the comparison with populism, I am providing a much more sympathetic reading of the neo-socialists than they generally receive. So if you're asking me, do I think that the critique of left populism that is made in Europe today applies to Latin America? I think they are different contexts, and so it would probably be a mistake to apply the same critique. If you're asking whether I think Blum's critique, whether he would have applied it to Latin America, I think he probably absolutely would have done. I think that Blum had a very sort of economically determinist approach that means he would not have been sympathetic to an attempt to do things differently elsewhere, with the possible exception of if he just saw it as building a republic. Because I think one thing is that Blum was sort of sympathetic to the idea that, well, you have to defend the bourgeois republic, you have to see that as a real gain for the workers, even if it is not socialism. So he might have been in favor of a kind of populism designed to give you a republic, but he would have been very against anything that presented itself as populism giving you socialism. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks so much. Yes, thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question, Nicholas. Can I go to Siochu?
Yeah, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all the panelists. I really enjoyed all your papers and your presentations. However, my question specifically concerns Iker, and I would like to it's a request for elaboration, and I would like to first appreciate once more your essay. I really liked and was fascinated by all your efforts to delineate all these transnational connections that Hobsbawm had, and also your effort to read his 1977 essay, not retrospectively, but how there are cases of his responses in previous crises, his crises, how there are traces in the traces of the argument that he makes in 1977 essay is in his responses beforehand. But still, I think you emphasize about this moment, post 1968 moment, and the argument that you make in the conclusion, and which is traced in all through your paper, is really intriguing. How Hobsbawm has commonalities with the new tradition within the left, not only the same chronological but also geographical scope. And you mentioned not only about the effect of Paris and Prague, but very slightly about his responses to problems in Chile. I just wanted to kind of elaborate how these, not only Hobsbawm's response to Chile, but also the discussions that he had with, especially you emphasized the influence of Communist Party Italy, like what kind of discussions they had, not only about this non-European phenomenon, and could you elaborate further about that?
Yeah, so in terms of what is the debate in the 70s, especially from 1968, as I mentioned before, Hobsbawm had a lot of contacts with people from the Communist Party of Italy, but he also traveled a lot in the 60s to Latin America. He knew many of the contacts and people from Latin America. He has a good friendship with Quijano, who was a Marxist thinking in Peru. He spent sometimes in the 1960s, in particular in 1962, visiting Peru, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, and he entered in contact with many communists there, and he reflected on the potential of a social revolution in Latin America based on the Cuban case, and then some things that were happening in other countries. Now, in terms of what is Chile in Hobsbawm thought, what is Chile in the Italian Communist Party, the impact in 1968 in the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, is twofold. First of what it meant Praga, and the idea that you cannot be close to Moscow, and you need to get rid of the Moscow influence and be kind of like independent parties. And secondly, the emergence of new social movements. Now, in the context of Italy, was not just what happened in Paris, but also what is called the hot autumn of 1978 and 68 and 1969, when the occupation of factories in Turin, that made the Italian Communist Party to reflect on the fact that we need to rethink our strategy, because these new social movements are not claiming to be members of the party. We need to kind of join who is the working class and who are these new social movements. This went to what is called the Compromiso Histórico, historical compromise of Enrico Berlinguer, who tried to push this kind of broad alliances, unity and diversity, to join the new social movements of the 60s and then the traditional working class. In the context of 1973, the Italian Communist Party looked very promising in the polls. It seems that they could win the election. So the party started to reflect what happened if we get into power. We will be able to push our politics. We will be able to push our communist policies in Italy. And that's when they start to look at Chile, what Salvador Allende's arrived to power in 1970. There were a lot of contacts between members of the Communist Party and Chileans during 1970s and 1973, of the possibilities to push a democratic socialist in Chile after the failure of Chile because of the coup of the United States and the murder of Salvador Allende. The Italian Communist Party reached the conclusion that they need to rethink what they will do if they get into power, because their idea is like, well, we are communists, we try to push a communist policies, if we reach power, we are probably gonna meet the same destiny as Salvador Allende, because the United States is probably gonna try to push a coup in our country. So the idea was like, we need to expand our support. We don't know, we must win not with the 51% of the vote, but with the maximum possible number of votes. Like, let's say that the support of the 80–90% of the population, because if we have the majority that support us, not only the civilian population, but the army, we will be able to push a democratic way to communism. And in that context, Eric Hobsbawm also participated in the pages of Renascença Unity, reflecting on the Chilean experience and how this could be translated to Europe. His conclusion was, let's push a new popular front politics, because that's what basically they tried to do in Chile. Let's try to build a party, or let's try to build a movement that aligns with everyone in society, from the middle class, from the feminists, from the sexual revolution, the working class. And if we get the majority, we will be able democratically to construct a socialist country that will not be defeated by US intervention.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think David has a question on Hobsbawm and crisis.
Sorry, me or?
No, it's not you, David. David Parker.
Right. Can you hear and see me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's fine. I just want to say that although I think we've had a very interesting exposition about all the influences on Hobsbawm, and I wouldn't wish to dispute any of them really, I just don't see how it contributed to a crisis in his Marxism or his history. And I think it underestimates the continuities in his thought. In the paper which you delivered, you put quite a lot of weight, Iker, on the Hobsbawm's introduction to the Grundrisse, where he referred to the fact that in classic Marxism, class wasn't elevated out of the theory as a cause, a historical cause in its own right. But in that page, he actually is specifically referring to the preface to the Critique of Political Economy. And that's important because that wasn't an accident. The historians group was brought up on the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, along with Engels' letters about base and superstructure. So for him, that is not actually a departure. He's reflecting on something which he has already learned. It's expressed more thoroughly by Christopher Hill, his great comrade historian in the group, who elaborated much more extensively on the fact that social transformation from a Marxist point of view was a social transformation of the totality and not just one bit of it, and that's what the preface was all about, really, a condensation into a few lines of the Marxist view of immense social transformations involving the totality of society. And in that, of course, there is room for all the things which were put in the superstructure, ideology, ideas, and all the rest of it, which Hobsbawm later pointed out, probably not strongly enough, was a consequence of the fact that this model, so often derided by critics of Marxism, actually allowed for ideas and superstructure and ideology and culture and all the rest to get its proper place. And I don't think there's any discontinuity reflected in the history writing of Hobsbawm. But of course, he always said these things, and he wasn't a great theorist, as you point out. He always said that, Marxist views about these things are only a starting point. And that's what he built on. And of course, he did build on all over the years. But I don't see, if you look at his writings, the 21 essays on history written in the later period, in that period which you find quite important, you can see anything which suggests a rejection of these basic theoretical assumptions with which he grew up with. The other point I would just wish to make, I developed this more in my own introduction in the edition of the papers of the 16th, 17th century section of the history group, which you might find useful. The only other point I wish to make now, because obviously a lot of other people want to speak, is that I don't see either in that context the famous March of Labour halted as marking a huge turning point either. Now, you argue quite strongly that it reflects what he's learning outside England and all the rest of it, but there is actually, unfortunately, nothing in that paper, in his paper itself, which says that's so. He described it as a simple survey of what's been happening to the British Labour movement, to the British working class. And that's how everybody read it at the time. That's how we all read it at the time. I mean, we were increasingly aware of Gramsci and all the rest of it, but nobody made that connection in the way that you've made it. So I'd like to see you consolidate that point. That can be read as a simple empirical study in what E.P. Thompson called the quaintly empirical style of the British Marxist historians. And of course, the British Marxist historians are characterized by that quaintly empirical style. The theory's there at the back somewhere, but they weren't, any of them, really great theorists, much more than Hobsbawm was. And it's interesting, towards the end of that period, Hobsbawm says, nowadays, you actually can't tell the difference very often between what is Marxist and what is not. And that is not, he said, a cause for regret. He continued to write in that style. He also, along with Christopher Hill, made another couple of comments. I'll leave you with a couple of comments, which may be provocative and interesting. But Christopher Hill said in his later period, he said, we arrived independently at some of the ideas of Gramsci. And I assume he was referring to the way the British Marxist historians developed their own interest in culture and cultural dominance and the way that is used. And Hobsbawm says, if Gramsci hadn't invented the word hegemony, we would have called it something else. I'll just leave you with that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting comments. It is true that probably in this paper I haven't reflected not of the what was the context of the British and his influence with the Communist Party historian groups, especially what is the formative years of 1946 to 1956 and how this affect the way he wrote history. I mean, one of the points that I have been trying to do is trying to look at Hobsbawm's political commitment beyond the British island, because I sometimes had the impression, especially in this historiography, that we tend to overlook what happened in the UK and not to see how there are also a lot of connections and links and ups and downs between the UK and other countries, especially in Western Europe, but also, as I was mentioning with Hobsbawm, with Latin America. In terms of the writing of his history, I do feel that perhaps you might be right that it's not such a strong brick, but I do think there has been changes from the 1950s to at least 1977 and beyond. Perhaps the focus will be more, rather than how he understood history, more on the way that he was thinking about the political strategy of the Communist Party, what was he himself as a member of the Communist Party. But I agree that I should definitely expand and look more at what is the specific context of the UK. My thesis, I do look at the British left in the 50s and 60s, and of course there was already some debates about the concept of class. I think, if I remember properly, already from Stuart Hall and other members in the 60s. But I think the point of Arizona is how well he managed to spark controversies in the late 70s in what he wrote, how he says, and especially that he was a known historian of labor and also a member of the Communist Party. Another way of reading is that not in the context of 1977, it was this long crisis decades in the UK that it was defined, as the decline, as the moment that things needed to be changed. And perhaps that's why Hobsbawm was so successfully to call for a rethink of the strategy in 1977.
Okay, great. Thank you for the question and the answer. I know that Tim and David Klemperer both have questions, but I thought I'd give priority to the audience member Niyusha first, and then perhaps if we have time, we can come back to our speakers. Do you want to go ahead, Niyusha?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I have a question for Tim. And thank you all for your papers. Yeah, so I have a question about the conclusion you make about the reason why they kind of stop engaging with each other, the New Left and people within development studies. Because I kind of want to push you on that a little bit because I'm kind of skeptical of it. Or I wonder if it's like a little too generous to the New Left. So the reason you give in your conclusion is something, from my understanding of it, is that they kind of stop having that common ground, right? Because development studies becomes really specialist and they start being like area focused, very, yeah, kind of a different kinds of expertise. And the New Left is kind of busy trying to engage with these political philosophies of kind of like Habermas, right? But I sort of wonder if there's other kind of more like petty reasons involved. So like how much does like audience and like legitimacy and like the authority of disciplines matter here, especially like who is the New Left appealing to, and like would that factor into it? Because I think on the development studies side, it's easy to kind of see why some of those shifts happen, because, you know, maybe like more than any other discipline, like development studies and then area studies are so funding determined, right? And so you can see why they would start taking particular directions, because their audience becomes those funders, right? So then for the New Left, I wonder in what ways their audience and like the kind of authority and legitimacy they want to have matter, especially because I think, you know, if the new common ground would have been to take on some of these political philosophies, well, like development studies is also where you have like Emergence and where you have Nespa making all of these, you know, they're coming up with certain like political ontologies too, that you could really see the New Left picking some fights with. You know, like there's plenty of fertile ground for having some arguments there. Yeah, so I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yes, thanks so much, Nusha. I agree with you that their conclusion's a bit shaky. I just was trying to conclude, and I have to think about it. I could give you a very specific answer about one of these members of the New Left. Like, I was reading Harold Volpe after the end of apartheid, when he was deciding whether he wanted to return to South Africa. He was at Essex, so you know, he's part of the formation of what will become the Essex School, so, of discourse analysis with Ernesto Laclau and with them. And he's in the sociology department. And he writes in a letter like, I'm not taken seriously here as a sociologist. Like they don't see this as sociology. So I guess like there was a difficulty. Most of these theorists weren't in philosophy departments. They were in sociology departments, and kind of my paper makes it seem as if development studies in the third world is this huge burgeoning field. But I think there are frameworks for area studies and development studies, but within like broader sociology departments, these more theoretical and the focus on the third world is just not taken that seriously. So I don't want to make it seem like the 1970s and 1980s were necessarily these, they were exceptional in a certain way because of the importance of foreign aid and the involvement of Britain in the development projects of the third world. But that's not to say that they were like central to the social sciences. I think you're right, that it was easier for people to kind of shift their idiom towards bigger debates in political philosophy, since they were already angled quite philosophically and alienated from more empirical research. And it kind of made sense for them to pivot there. But I am interested in why, you know, the disappointment of the prospects of building socialism, social democracy, led, I mean, because Ernesto Laclau, you know, in the 1970s, he's deeply engaged, coming from South America, with debates around like socialist strategy, and development and dependency and all of these things, which are big questions. And all of a sudden this all implodes in the 1980s. So I was just trying to like very quickly show the influence of that. But I think you're right. A lot of it is more cynical than I make it look.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for the question and the response. We're almost out of time, and I know that Tim and David had some questions for their other panelists, but perhaps if we're all in email contact, so perhaps if you could email them to each other, that would be best. Unless there's any other last quick questions from the audience. Can't see anyone with their hands up or anything. I know that Jack, who actually Jacqueline from the previous session, also had a question for David, and I'll send that to you by email as well. Yeah, so with that, I'll finish up, and I'd like to thank our three panelists and everyone in the audience. We've had three really wonderful papers, and I think we've gone into quite a lot of depth in terms of the papers and got some really good responses and probed some of the points and highlighted some of the areas where we want to know more, in effect. And yeah, and our next session is at 4 o'clock. Just to say that the Eventbrite for the sessions, both the rest of the sessions today and the sessions tomorrow, is now closed. So if there are any sessions that you haven't signed up for on the Eventbrite but you want to go to, if you could drop a message to us at markseminaradmin@riseup.net, that's also in the chat, then we can send you the Zoom link personally. But if you've signed up for the Eventbrite, then that's fine. But if there's any that you haven't signed up for but you'd like to attend, then please drop us a message there. Other than that, I'll just thank our speakers again and see you all at 4 o'clock.